Lucas's hand lingered for a moment before dropping to his side. Talita met his gaze in the mirror, searching for reassurance in his eyes. He smiled faintly, but there was something distant about it, like his mind was elsewhere. "You sure everything's okay?" she asked, keeping her voice light. He nodded. "Of course, just a lot on my mind today." Talita turned to face him fully, resting her hands against his chest. "It's our wedding day. What could possibly be on your mind besides this?" Lucas hesitated, his thumb brushing lightly over her hand. Nothing important, just family stuff. Her stomach twisted slightly at the mention of his family. It was the one part of their relationship she couldn't fully understand. For years, she had felt like an outsider. When it came to them, Lucas rarely spoke about his parents, and when he did, it was brief, little more than surface-level details. She knew his father worked in finance, and his mother had once been a teacher, but there was no warmth in those stories. No shared family. Holidays, no anecdotes about childhood memories. "Are they here yet?" she asked softly. Lucas's eyes shifted slightly, glancing toward the door. "Yeah, they got here about an hour ago." Talita felt her breath hitch, but she masked it with a smile. "I guess I'll finally get to meet them then." He returned her smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, they're excited to meet you." Before she could respond, another knock sounded at the door, louder this time. Clara's voice drifted through from the hallway. "Talita, the guests are arriving. We need you downstairs in 10 minutes. Lucas leaned in, kissing her forehead gently. "I'll see you down there, okay?" Talita nodded, watching as he slipped out of the room. The door clicked softly behind him, leaving her alone with the quiet hum of anticipation. She turned back to the mirror, smoothing the front of her dress once more. Her reflection stared back at her, poised, calm. But beneath the surface, her thoughts swirled. Why hadn't his parents come to meet her before today? Why did Lucas always seem to dance around the subject whenever she asked? Pushing the thoughts aside, Talita straightened her shoulders and stepped toward the door. The weight of the dress followed her as she moved, each step echoing softly against the wooden floor. Downstairs, the living room buzzed with quiet conversation. Guests milled about, sipping champagne and exchanging polite greetings. Talita caught sight of familiar faces, friends from college, co-workers, distant relatives, but nowhere among them did she spot Lucas's family. Clara met her at the bottom of the stairs, gently looping her arm through Talita's. "Ready?" Clara's voice was warm, but her eyes searched Talita's face carefully. "As ready as I'll ever be," Talita replied with a small laugh. The two of them made their way through the crowd, receiving congratulations and warm hugs along the way. Talita smiled and thanked each guest, but her eyes continued scanning for any sign of Lucas's parents. "Hello guys, if you like our stories and haven't subscribed yet, support our work and subscribe to the channel to help us." Near the back of the room, she finally spotted them. A man and woman stood close to the wall, speaking quietly to one another. The resemblance to Lucas was subtle, the same sharp jawline, the same quiet intensity in their eyes. But there was something colder about them, something that made Talita hesitate. Lucas's mother caught her gaze first. Her expression didn't shift, but her eyes flicked over Talita, lingering for a second too long. Talita approached with Clara by her side, her pulse quickening slightly. She extended her hand politely. "It's so nice to finally meet you," Talita said, hoping her voice didn't betray the slight tremble she felt. Lucas's father shook her hand briefly, offering a tight smile. "Likewise." His mother, however, barely touched Talita's hand before letting go. "You've certainly put together a beautiful event," she said, her tone polite but distant. Talita thanked her, unsure of how to interpret the coolness in her voice. Clara squeezed Talita's arm gently before stepping away, sensing the tension in the air. As Talita stood with Lucas's parents, the silence grew heavier between them. She searched for something to say, some way to bridge the gap that felt wider with each passing second. "I hope you've both been enjoying the evening so far," she offered. Lucas's mother smiled thinly. "It's been interesting." Before Talita could respond, Lucas reappeared, sliding effortlessly into the space beside her. He greeted his parents quickly, but there was no warmth exchanged between them. "Everything okay?" he asked, glancing between Talita and his mother. His mother gave a small nod. "Of course. We were just admiring how much effort Talita has put into all of this." Lucas's father chuckled softly. "Yes, she's certainly dedicated." There was something about the way he said it that prickled beneath Talita's skin, but she forced a smile regardless. Lucas wrapped his arm around her waist, gently steering her away from the conversation. "We should get ready. The ceremony's about to start." Talita let herself be led away, though her mind lingered on the brief interaction. As they moved through the crowd, she leaned in closer to Lucas. "Your parents seem quiet," she said carefully. He smiled faintly. "They just need time, don't worry about them." Talita nodded, but the feeling of unease stayed with her. The ceremony passed in a blur of vows and soft music. Talita focused on Lucas's eyes as he spoke, the sincerity in his voice washing away some of her earlier doubts. For a brief moment, everything felt right. It wasn't until the reception began that the weight returned. Talita noticed Lucas's parents seated at a table near the back of the room, speaking quietly to one another. Occasionally their eyes drifted toward her, and though their expressions never shifted, Talita felt the scrutiny. Clara appeared at her side again, following her gaze. "They're hard to read," Clara whispered. Talita nodded. "I don't know if it's just me, but I get the feeling they don't like me." Clara's eyes narrowed slightly. "They don't even know you." Talita laughed softly, but the sound lacked humor. "Exactly." As the reception carried on, Talita found herself moving through the crowd with the same polite smile she'd worn all evening. Guests laughed, music filled the room, and glasses clinked in celebration. But her attention kept drifting back to Lucas's parents. They hadn't left their table. Occasionally, his mother's gaze would meet hers across the room, lingering, just long enough for Talita to notice before she turned away, resuming her quiet conversation with Lucas's father. Lucas was swept into conversation with some of his friends near the bar, leaving Talita momentarily alone. Clara appeared at her side, nudging her gently with her elbow. "You need to stop looking so serious," Clara teased, handing Talita a glass of champagne. Talita took it with a grateful smile but didn't sip. "I just feel out of place." Clara's brow furrowed. "Out of place? It's your wedding." Talita's eyes flicked toward Lucas's parents. Clara followed her gaze, her expression softening. "They're stiff, but who cares? You're not marrying them." Talita forced a small laugh. "I guess not." Still, she couldn't shake the weight of their presence, as if their disapproval hovered over her like an unwelcome guest. The evening progressed, and Talita managed to push the thought aside for brief stretches of time. Through the first dance, the toasts, and quiet moments with Lucas, when the world around them faded to the background. But every time she glanced in their direction, the tension returned. It wasn't until later, as she slipped away to the restroom, that she overheard the first words she wasn't meant to hear. The hall was empty as Talita approached the powder room near the far end of the venue, just past the quieter reception area. The voices drifted from around the corner, low but clear enough to catch her attention. "She's pleasant, I suppose." Talita's steps slowed. She recognized the voice immediately, Lucas's mother. "I don't understand why he rushed into this," his father responded. "She seems nice enough, but it feels forced, like she's trying too hard." Talita stood frozen just a few feet away, her pulse quickening. "Exactly. Look at all this," his mother continued, her tone sharp with quiet disapproval. "Who spends this much on a wedding these days? It's excessive." And Lucas barely contributed. She paid for most of it herself. "I know, it's desperate." Talita's grip tightened around the edge of her dress, her heart pounding in her ears. "I just don't see it lasting," his mother added softly. "Lucas has always been impressionable. He'll realize eventually." A lump formed in Talita's throat. She stepped back quietly, retreating down the hall before they could see her. By the time she returned to the reception, the room felt different, brighter, louder, more suffocating. She spotted Lucas laughing with his friends near the dance floor, unaware of the storm brewing in her chest. Clara noticed the shift immediately as Talita approached their table, setting down her untouched glass of champagne. "What happened?" Clara asked, her voice low. Talita hesitated, glancing toward Lucas's parents, who had returned to their usual silence. "I heard them talking about me," Talita murmured. Clara leaned in, eyes narrowing. "What did they say?" Talita swallowed hard, forcing a neutral expression. "They think I'm trying too hard, that the wedding is excessive. They don't think we'll last." Clara's lips parted in disbelief. "Are you serious? What?" Talita shook her head quickly. "Don't. It's not worth it." But the words had already settled deep, gnawing at the fragile foundation beneath her excitement for the day. Lucas joined them moments later, blissfully unaware. His arm draped around Talita's waist as he pressed a kiss to her temple. "Having fun?" he asked, grinning. Talita smiled, but it felt thin. "Yeah, of course." Clara shot Lucas a look, but he didn't seem to notice. The evening wore on, and Talita kept up the performance, laughing at the right moments and dancing when she needed to. But as the night drew closer to its end, something shifted inside her. When the final songs began to play, and guests started to say their goodbyes, Talita slipped away again, this time to the bridal suite upstairs, where she could be alone. She stood by the window, staring out at the city lights. The reflection of her dress shimmered faintly in the glass, but all she saw was the weight behind it. The sound of the door opening made her glance over her shoulder. Lucas stepped inside, his tie loosened, his jacket slung over his arm. "There you are," he said softly. "I've been looking for you." Talita turned, her hands falling to her sides. Lucas approached, sensing something in her expression. "What's wrong?" She hesitated, but the words rose before she could stop them. "Why didn't your parents meet me before today?" Lucas's brows lifted slightly, caught off guard by the question. "I told you. They live far away and they don't really do things like this." "They don't like me," Talita said, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. Lucas frowned, moving closer. "That's not true. They just need time." "I heard them talking," Talita admitted, cutting him off gently. "They think this wedding is excessive. They think I paid for everything because I'm desperate. They think we won't last." Lucas's expression hardened, but he said nothing. Talita waited, but the defense she expected never came. Finally, he sighed. "They're difficult. They don't always mean what they say." "That doesn't make it better," she replied softly. Lucas took her hands, his eyes pleading. "I married you today. That's what matters, not them." Talita nodded, but doubt lingered. As Lucas kissed her, she closed her eyes, but the words she overheard echoed still. The guests had mostly gone by the time Talita and Lucas returned to the reception hall. The room felt quieter now, with only a few clusters of people lingering by the bar or gathered in small circles, laughing softly. The glow of the chandeliers seemed warmer, more intimate. But Talita felt colder than she had all night. Lucas's hand rested lightly on her back as they walked toward the remaining guests. His touch, once comforting, now felt distant. She forced a smile as they passed by friends and family offering their congratulations, but her thoughts remained, locked on the conversation she had overheard. Lucas excused himself to speak with the venue manager, leaving Talita by Clara's side once again. Clara watched him go, then leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you going to say something to him?" Talita's eyes stayed on Lucas, watching him laugh with the staff, easy and unbothered. "I don't know," she admitted, swirling the champagne in her glass. "I thought today would feel different, but now, I'm not sure what to say." Clara's gaze hardened. "You can't just let them get away with that. This is your day, Talita. They shouldn't be talking about you like that." Talita took a deep breath, exhaling slowly as she scanned the room. Lucas's parents were still seated at their table, their faces unreadable as they sipped from their glasses. She felt the weight of their presence like an anchor, dragging her down into the doubt she thought she had escaped. For a moment, Talita considered letting it go. She could ignore their words, pretend she hadn't heard anything, and move forward as if nothing had happened. But the thought felt heavy, suffocating. If she let it slide now, it would fester, growing into something she couldn't contain. Her grip tightened on the glass. "I'm not going to let it slide," she said finally, her voice firm. Clara's eyes lit up with approval. Talita set her glass down carefully, smoothing the front of her dress as she made her way across the room. Each step felt deliberate, measured. She could feel Clara's eyes on her, silently cheering her on. When she reached the table, Lucas's parents looked up, both surprised by her sudden appearance. "Talita," his mother said, her smile thin, "is everything all right?" Talita met her gaze, holding it steady. "I heard what you said earlier," she replied calmly. "About the wedding. About me." Lucas's father shifted in his seat, exchanging a quick glance with his wife. "You must have misunderstood," his mother began, but Talita shook her head softly. "I didn't misunderstand. I just want you to know something." She straightened, letting the words settle before continuing. "I married Lucas because I love him, but I won't apologize for how much effort I put into this day. I deserve to feel celebrated, and if you can't see that, then that's your problem, not mine." For a brief moment, neither of them said anything. Lucas's mother opened her mouth as if to respond, but Talita didn't wait. She turned and walked away, feeling the weight begin to lift with every step. Talita didn't stop until she reached the far side of the reception hall, near the large glass doors that led to the balcony. The cool night air whispered through the crack beneath them, inviting her outside. She hesitated for a moment, glancing back over her shoulder. Lucas was still deep in conversation, unaware of the brief confrontation that had just unfolded between his wife and his parents. Clara joined her moments later, sliding a glass of water into Talita's hand. "I saw that," Clara said, a smirk, tugging at her lips. "I'm proud of you." Talita exhaled, leaning against the doorframe. "I didn't plan to say anything. It just came out. Sometimes that's the best way." The soft hum of conversation filled the space behind them, but Talita's attention drifted to the quiet beyond the glass doors. She pushed them open gently, stepping out onto the balcony. The city stretched before her, lights twinkling against the dark sky. Clara followed, closing the door behind them, sealing off the sounds of the reception. Talita rested her hands on the stone railing, breathing in the crisp air. For the first time that night, she felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. You know," Clara began, breaking the silence, "it doesn't matter what they think. You're not marrying them, you're marrying Lucas." Talita's fingers curled against the cold stone. "I know, but it still stings." Clara leaned beside her, crossing her arms. "They'll come around, and if they don't, Lucas needs to be the one to handle it." Talita let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "That's the thing, though. He never handles it. He avoids conflict like it's his full-time job." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Have you told him that?" Talita hesitated. "That's what I thought," Clara said with a knowing smile. "Look, tonight is supposed to be about you two. Don't let his parents ruin it. If Lucas loves you, and I know he does, then he'll stand by you. But he can't fix what he doesn't know." Talita's gaze lingered on the horizon. She knew Clara was right. After a long pause, she finally spoke. "I'll talk to him, just not tonight." Clara nodded, satisfied with that answer. The sound of the balcony doors sliding open drew their attention. Lucas stepped out, his brow furrowed slightly as he approached them. "There you are," he said, slipping his hands into his pockets. "I've been looking for you." Clara shot Talita a quick glance before straightening. "I'll give you two a minute." She disappeared back inside, leaving them alone beneath the soft glow of the city lights. Lucas joined Talita by the railing, standing close enough for his arm to brush against hers. "Everything okay?" he asked gently. Talita nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the skyline. "You disappeared for a while," Lucas pressed, his voice careful. "I needed some air," she replied softly. Lucas was quiet for a moment, studying her face. You've been off since the ceremony. Is it my parents? Talita's lips pressed together. She considered lying, brushing it off to keep the peace, but the weight in her chest urged her otherwise. I overheard them, she admitted, meeting his gaze. Earlier, I heard what they said about me, about the wedding. Lucas's expression shifted, his jaw tightening slightly. They didn't mean it, he said quickly, but Talita shook her head. They did, Lucas, and that's fine. I don't need them to like me, but I need you to see how hard this is for me. Lucas exhaled, leaning forward against the railing. His hand covered hers, warm and steady. I know they can be difficult, he said carefully. They've always been hard on me too. It's not about you. But it feels like it is, Talita replied softly. Lucas's grip on her hand tightened just slightly. I'll talk to them. Talita's heart softened at his words. But the doubt lingered. I need you to mean that, Lucas, she whispered, because I can't keep feeling like I'm the only one fighting for this. Lucas turned to her fully, his gaze earnest. I do mean it. You shouldn't have to feel like that. Not tonight, not ever. The sincerity in his voice eased the ache in her chest. Talita let out a slow breath, leaning into him, his arms wrapped around her, pulling her close. For a moment, the weight of the evening melted away, leaving only the two of them standing beneath the stars. Lucas pressed a kiss to the top of her head. We're going to be okay. Talita closed her eyes, letting herself believe him. Even if the road ahead wasn't perfect, she knew they'd face it together. The soft hum of the city drifted around them as Talita rested her head against Lucas's shoulder. For a while they stood in silence, the quiet stretching comfortably between them. The weight that had pressed down on Talita throughout the night felt lighter now, though not entirely gone. Lucas's fingers traced soft circles along the small of her back, grounding her. Talita listened to the faint music filtering through the glass doors behind them, the reception still carrying on without them. She thought about how much effort had gone into this day, the planning, the stress, the anticipation. And yet, here she was, far from the center of it all, simply relieved to have a moment of peace. Lucas broke the silence first, his voice low and thoughtful. You know, I should have done a better job protecting you from all of this. Talita lifted her head, looking up at him. Protecting me? He met her gaze, his brow creased slightly. From them, from the way they can be. Talita searched his face, seeing the regret etched there. It was rare for Lucas to admit fault so openly. I never expected you to protect me, she said, softly. I just needed you to stand next to me. Lucas nodded, his grip on her tightening. I'm sorry. I guess I thought if I ignored it, it would go away, but it's not fair to you. Talita smiled faintly, brushing her fingers against his jaw. No, it's not. But I know this isn't easy for you either. I get that. He kissed her knuckles, the tenderness of the gesture filling the space where words couldn't. Talita shifted slightly, leaning back against the railing. Do you think they'll ever accept me? Lucas was quiet for a moment, considering her question carefully. I don't know. My parents have always been reserved. They don't open up easily, but I do know they'll have to respect you, especially after tonight. Talita arched a brow, amusement flickering in her eyes. You think they respect me after what I said to them? Lucas chuckled softly. Oh, they probably don't know what to think right now, but they'll learn. Talita laughed under her breath, shaking her head. The tension she had carried for hours seemed to dissipate more with each passing second. Honestly, Lucas added, I think part of them respects that you didn't back down. Most people would have just smiled and ignored it. I almost did, Talita admitted, brushing her hair behind her ear. But I realized I couldn't start our marriage like that. I needed to say something, even if it didn't change anything. Lucas cupped her cheek, tilting her face toward his. It did change something for me. His words wrapped around her like a shield, soft but strong. Talita closed her eyes briefly, pressing her forehead against his. Thank you, she whispered. Lucas pulled her in, holding her as if the rest of the world had fallen away. After a moment, Talita broke the embrace, her eyes flicking toward the glass doors leading back inside. We should probably go back. People are going to start wondering where we are. Lucas smiled, lacing his fingers with hers. Let them wonder. This is our night. Talita laughed softly but allowed him to guide her toward the door. As they stepped inside, Clara spotted them instantly, her arms crossed with a playful smirk. About time. I was starting to think you'd eloped. Talita grinned. Tempting, but I think we'll stick with the fancy party. Clara's gaze shifted briefly toward the back of the room where Lucas's parents still sat, now deep in conversation. Talita followed her line of sight, but felt less burdened by their presence than before. Clara leaned closer, dropping her voice. They didn't say anything else, did they? Talita shook her head. No, and even if they did, I'm not sure it would matter. Clara smiled approvingly. Good. They'll figure it out eventually. Lucas pressed a kiss to Talita's temple, whispering softly enough that only she could hear. They will. And even if they don't, I'm with you. Talita squeezed his hand, letting the words settle into her heart. As the evening carried on, the doubts and shadows faded. The night wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that was enough. The reception hall had thinned out as the night wore on, with only the closest friends and family remaining. The music softened, the laughter quieted, and the glow of the chandeliers cast long shadows across the polished floor. Talita sat at a small table near the corner, her hand resting lightly on Lucas's arm as he spoke with one of his friends. Her mind wandered, drifting between snippets of conversation and the hum of distant voices. Across the room, Lucas's parents remained seated, their expressions unreadable as they exchanged hushed words. Talita tried not to watch them, but her gaze lingered longer than she intended. She knew she had said her piece, stood her ground, and yet the uncertainty still gnawed at the edges of her thoughts. Clara approached, sliding into the seat beside her with a soft thud. She glanced toward Lucas's parents and then back at Talita, raising an eyebrow. They haven't left yet? Clara asked, her voice light but laced with curiosity. Talita shook her head. No, they've been sitting there all night. Clara leaned in slightly. Maybe they're waiting for you to trip over your dress or spill something, you know, to confirm their theory. Talita let out a quiet laugh, grateful for the momentary relief Clara's humor provided. I think they're just not sure what to do with me now, Talita replied, swirling the champagne in her glass. I wasn't exactly subtle. Clara grinned. Good. Sometimes people need to hear things plainly. Lucas caught Talita's eye from across the table, his expression softening when he saw her smile. He excused himself from the conversation and walked over, draping his jacket over the back of her chair. You okay? He asked, brushing his hand along her back. Talita nodded, leaning into his touch. I'm fine. Just decompressing. Lucas glanced at his parents, following her gaze. He hesitated for a moment, then straightened. I'm going to talk to them, he said firmly, as if deciding in real time. Talita's eyes widened slightly. Lucas, you don't have to... I do, he interrupted gently, pressing a kiss to the side of her head. You handled your part, now it's my turn. Before she could protest, Lucas crossed the room, his steps slow but purposeful. Talita's heart raced as she watched him approach the table. Clara leaned closer, whispering under her breath. Okay, this is about to get interesting. Lucas pulled out the chair across from his parents and sat down. Talita couldn't hear what was being said, but the shift in his body language was unmistakable. His shoulders squared, his expression calm but resolute. Lucas's father spoke first, gesturing slightly with his hand. Lucas listened intently, nodding occasionally, but not interrupting. His mother's lips pressed into a thin line, her arms crossing tightly over her chest. Talita tapped her fingers nervously against the table. Clara watched the scene like it was the season finale of her favorite show. I can't tell if this is going well or not, Talita whispered. Clara squinted. I mean, they're not yelling, so that's a plus. Minutes stretched on and slowly something shifted. Lucas's mother uncrossed her arms, leaning slightly forward. His father's stern expression softened just enough to be noticeable. Lucas's hand moved across the table, palm up, and after a long pause, his mother placed her hand in his. Talita exhaled, realizing she had been holding her breath. Lucas's eyes flicked toward her across the room, and he smiled faintly, as if to say, "It's okay now." As he stood and walked back toward Talita, she straightened in her seat, searching his face for answers. "Well?" she asked the moment he sat beside her. Lucas reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I told them the truth. That I love you, and nothing they say will change that. And that they don't have to like everything about our life, but they will respect you. Because if they can't, they'll lose me." Talita's chest tightened. She squeezed his hand, the weight of his words sinking in fully. "And," Lucas smiled softly, "and they heard me. I think they needed to." Clara leaned back in her chair, arms crossed triumphantly. "Finally, took him long enough." Talita laughed, her tension dissolving into warmth. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly, brushing her thumb along Lucas's hand. "I'm proud of you," he replied, his voice gentle but sincere. As the night wound down, Talita and Lucas stood by the entrance, bidding farewell to the last few guests. His parents approached slowly, lingering just slightly behind the others. Lucas's father extended his hand first, his grip firm, but not unkind. "Congratulations," he said, his tone more genuine than Talita had expected. "Thank you," Talita replied, meeting his gaze steadily. Lucas's mother stepped forward next, her eyes softer than they had been all evening. She didn't speak immediately, but when she did, her words carried more weight than Talita anticipated. "You've put together a beautiful wedding," she said quietly, "and I can see how much Lucas cares for you." Talita smiled, her heart settling. "I care for him just as much." His mother nodded slowly. "That's what matters." As they left, Lucas slipped his arm around Talita's waist, pulling her close as they watched his parents disappear down the hall. "That felt different," Talita admitted, tilting her head toward him. Lucas nodded, kissing the top of her head. "It's a start." The two of them stood there for a moment longer, the weight of the evening lifting as the first hints of dawn began to creep into the sky. Whatever lay ahead, Talita knew they would face it together, and for the first time that night, she truly believed that was enough. The soft hum of the venue faded as the last guests filtered out, leaving behind the faint glow of candles and the scattered remains of the evening. Talita stood near the center of the empty reception hall, her heels echoing softly against the marble floor as she traced slow circles around the room. The flicker of lights overhead danced across the polished surfaces, casting long shadows that stretched toward the edges of the space. Lucas watched her from a few feet away, his jacket draped loosely over his shoulder, tie undone around his collar. His gaze lingered, soft and unspoken, as if he was memorizing the sight of her standing there in her wedding dress, surrounded by the remnants of the night they had built together. "Feels strange now that everyone's gone," Talita said quietly, running her hand along the back of one of the empty chairs. Lucas stepped closer, slipping his hand into hers. "A little, but I kind of like it." She glanced up at him with a soft smile. "You just like that it's quiet now?" He chuckled under his breath. "Maybe, but mostly I like that I have you all to myself." Talita's chest warmed at his words, the lingering tension from earlier slowly unraveling. The weight of the evening, the nerves, the confrontation with his parents, the uncertainty, now felt distant like a storm that had passed just beyond the horizon. Lucas pulled her gently toward the dance floor, the faint echo of music still lingering in the back of her mind. With no one else around, they began to sway, his hand resting lightly against the curve of her waist, her fingers brushing against his shoulder. They danced in silence, their movements slow and unhurried, the moment existing for no one but them. Talita rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. "I'm glad you talked to them," she whispered. Lucas's grip tightened slightly, his lips brushing her hair. "Me too. I should have done it sooner. It's not just about tonight," she added softly. "I needed to know that you would stand up for us, not just when things are easy." Lucas slowed his movements, tilting her chin up so their eyes met. "I will. From now on, I promise." Talita searched his face, seeing the sincerity reflected back at her. She believed. Him. A soft knock echoed from the doorway, pulling them from the quiet moment. Clara appeared, leaning casually against the frame, arms crossed with a smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Am I interrupting something?" Lucas grinned. "You always are." Clara laughed, stepping further inside. "Well, I figured. Someone should tell you the driver's waiting, unless you two plan on spending the night here." Talita smiled, brushing her hand down the front of her dress. "Right, we should probably go." Clara gave Talita a quick hug before stepping back toward the door. "I'll see you tomorrow, and Lucas," she added with a playful glance over her shoulder. "Take care of her." Lucas nodded, resting his hand on the small of Talita's back as they followed Clara outside. The night air was crisp, stars stretching across the dark canvas above them as they stepped onto the cobblestone driveway. The car waited nearby, headlights casting long beams across the path ahead. Lucas opened the door for Talita, helping her inside before sliding in beside her. The driver nodded politely, and the car pulled away from the venue, the soft hum of the engine the only sound between them for a moment. Talita rested her head against the seat, watching the lights of the city blur past the window. Lucas's hand found hers, his thumb tracing soft patterns along her knuckles. "Lucas?" He turned to her, his gaze soft. "Yeah? Do you ever wonder if marriage will change things between us?" Lucas considered her question carefully, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know. Maybe in some ways. But I think that's normal." Talita nodded slowly. "I guess I just want to make sure we don't become one of those couples who stop trying. I've seen it happen. People get comfortable. They forget to fight for each other." Lucas squeezed her hand gently. "We won't. I know us. And if things ever feel like they're slipping, we'll talk, we'll fix it." Talita smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. "I believe you." The car moved steadily through the sleeping city, the streets quiet and peaceful. Talita closed her eyes, letting the soft rhythm of the road lull her into calm. Lucas's voice broke the silence after a few moments. "You know, no matter how hard tonight was, I wouldn't change it." Talita lifted her head slightly, looking up at him. "Really?" He nodded. "Because it brought us here. And I can't imagine anything better than this." Talita's heart swelled at his words, and she leaned in, pressing a soft kiss against his lips. As the car continued down the road, she held his hand tighter, knowing that whatever came next, whether easy or hard, they would face it together. The car continued to glide through the empty streets, the faint glow of streetlights casting fleeting patterns across Talita's dress. The city, once bustling with life, now seemed to exhale softly around them, as if the world itself was winding down for the night. Talita shifted slightly, resting her head on Lucas's shoulder as his arm wrapped protectively around her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. Rather, it felt like the calm after a storm, a space where words weren't necessary. Talita listened to the soft hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of Lucas's breathing, allowing herself to sink into the stillness. Lucas's thumb brushed lightly over the back of her hand, grounding her. The small gesture, subtle and gentle, carried more weight than anything his parents had said that night. Talita lifted her head slightly, breaking the quiet. "What do you think they'll say tomorrow?" Lucas glanced down at her, his brow raising slightly. "My parents?" She nodded, her gaze fixed on the faint lights outside the window. Lucas sighed, leaning his head back against the seat. "Honestly, I don't know. I'm not even sure if they'll bring it up. They're not exactly the confrontational type." Talita's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "No, they just talk behind closed doors." Lucas chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Yeah, they do." There was no bitterness in her voice, just quiet acceptance. Talita wasn't the type to hold grudges, and despite the tension earlier, she knew Lucas's parents weren't malicious. They were cautious, maybe even judgmental, but not cruel. "Do you think they'll ever fully accept me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas's arm tightened slightly around her shoulders, his lips pressing against her hair. "I think they already respect you more than they're willing to admit, but even if they didn't, it wouldn't change anything for me." Talita smiled faintly, though her heart still carried the weight of uncertainty. "I just want to feel like I belong," she admitted. Lucas shifted, turning slightly to face her. His eyes, soft but firm, locked with hers. "You belong with me, that's all that matters." Talita felt her chest tighten, the sincerity in his voice dissolving the lingering doubt. "I know," she whispered, leaning into him once more. The car slowed as they approached the hotel, the grand entrance glowing softly beneath elegant lanterns that framed the stone steps leading inside. The driver pulled to a smooth stop, stepping out to open the door for them. Lucas slid out first, extending his hand to help Talita from the car. She gathered the soft layers of her dress, carefully stepping onto the pavement. As they stood beneath the towering facade of the hotel, Talita's eyes wandered to the large glass doors. The quiet luxury of the space felt worlds away from the vulnerability she had felt earlier in the evening. Lucas guided her inside, his hand never leaving hers as they walked through the lobby. The elevator ride was silent, save for the soft chime as they reached their floor. Lucas slid the keycard into the door, pushing it open to reveal the suite beyond. A spacious room illuminated by the soft glow of city lights filtering through the tall windows. Talita stepped inside, letting out a quiet breath as she took in the space. A large bouquet of white roses sat on the side table, the faint scent drifting through the room. The bed, adorned with delicate linens, awaited them in the center, a quiet refuge after the long night. Lucas stepped up behind her, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. "Tired?" he asked softly, his breath warm against her ear. Talita smiled, tilting her head slightly to meet his gaze. "Exhausted." Lucas's hands slid down her arms, fingers lacing with hers. "Then let's get some rest." She turned in his arms, wrapping her hands around his neck. For a moment, they stood in the center of the room, eyes locked in quiet understanding. Lucas leaned in, pressing a soft kiss against her lips, lingering for just a breath longer than usual. When they pulled apart, Talita rested her forehead against his. "I love you," she whispered. Lucas's arms tightened around her. "I love you too." They moved through the room slowly, as if savoring each second. Talita slipped out of her dress, carefully hanging it on the edge of the closet door. Lucas loosened his tie, setting it aside with practiced ease. The night stretched on, and as they settled beneath the covers, Talita found herself drawn closer to him, their hands still intertwined beneath the sheets. In the quiet of the suite, the world outside faded away. For the first time that day, Talita felt truly at peace. Lucas brushed a stray strand of hair from her face, his voice breaking the silence once more. "You know, I think this is the happiest I've ever been." Talita smiled, her eyes closing as she nestled against him. "Me too." The city continued to hum outside their window, but in that room, it felt as if time had slowed to a gentle crawl. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whether with Lucas's parents or the inevitable bumps that came with marriage, Talita knew they would face them together. And as she drifted closer to sleep, wrapped in the warmth of his arms, she allowed herself to believe that was enough. The suite was wrapped in silence, the kind that only comes after long, emotional days. Talita lay beside Lucas, her head resting lightly against his chest, listening to the soft rhythm of his breathing. His arm draped over her, holding her close as if to shield her from any lingering doubt. The world outside the window seemed distant, the faint city lights a reminder that life continued beyond the quiet bubble they had created for themselves. Talita traced absent circles against Lucas's chest, her thoughts drifting despite the calm. The events of the evening, his parents' coldness, the confrontation, Lucas's defense of their relationship, still echoed faintly in her mind, like a distant hum she couldn't quite tune out. Lucas shifted slightly beneath her, tilting, his head down to catch her gaze. "You're thinking again," he murmured, his voice soft with amusement. Talita smiled faintly, not bothering to deny it. "I guess I am." Lucas brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering along her jawline. "About what?" She hesitated, letting out a slow breath. "Your parents." Lucas's expression softened, though his eyes darkened just slightly. "You're Still worried about them? Talita shrugged lightly, unsure how to explain the weight she felt. It's not worry exactly. I know what you said to them, and I believe you meant it. But part of me wonders if this is just the beginning, if there will always be something I'll have to prove. Lucas sat up slightly, propping himself against the headboard and pulling her with him. His hands cupped her face gently, tilting it so she had no choice but to meet his gaze. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, he said firmly. Not to them, not to me. You being here, standing by my side tonight, that's all that matters. Talita searched his eyes, seeing nothing but sincerity reflected back at her, and yet the doubt still lingered like a shadow just out of reach. I know, she whispered, leaning into his touch. But I guess part of me feels like this wasn't just about tonight, it's about what kind of life we're building. I want to feel like I belong in it, not like I'm constantly trying to fit into a space that wasn't made for me. Lucas's arms wrapped around her, pulling her into his lap as he rested his chin against the top of her head. He didn't speak right away, and Talita appreciated the silence that stretched between them. Comforting, not rushed. Finally he spoke, his voice quieter than before. I get that, I really do. And I know my parents can make you feel like an outsider sometimes. But this, he gestured around the room, his thumb grazing over her wedding band. This is ours, no one else's. Whatever space we make together. Talita smiled softly, warmth spreading through her chest. I like the sound of that. Lucas kissed the top of her head, his lips lingering for a moment. Good, because I'm not going anywhere. They stayed like that for a while, wrapped in each other's arms, until the exhaustion from the day finally began to weigh on Talita's body. Lucas shifted beneath her, gently guiding her back down to the mattress. Get some sleep, he whispered, tucking the blanket around her. I'll be right here. Talita nestled closer, her head against his shoulder as her eyes fluttered shut. But just as sleep began to pull her under, the faint buzz of Lucas's phone vibrated on the nightstand. Lucas groaned softly, reaching for it. I'll turn it off. Talita's eyes opened just slightly, catching the faint light of the screen illuminating his face. His expression shifted as he read the message, his brows knitting together. What is it? She asked, her voice laced with sleep. Lucas hesitated, setting the phone down carefully. It's nothing, just my mom. She wanted to know if we're free for lunch tomorrow. Talita blinked, surprised. Your mom wants to have lunch? Lucas gave a small, almost shy smile. Yeah, I guess she's trying. Talita considered the offer for a moment, a part of her still wary. But another part, perhaps the part that had always wanted to feel like she truly belonged, softened at the thought. Maybe we should go, she said softly, brushing her fingers against his arm. It could be a step forward. Lucas nodded, his thumb brushing lightly over her hand. If you're okay with that, then so am I. Talita rested her head against his chest once more, the soft rhythm of his heartbeat lulling her back towards sleep. And for the first time in a long while, she felt as though the walls between them and his family weren't as high as she once thought. Maybe they wouldn't disappear overnight, but brick by brick they could come down. As she drifted closer to sleep, Talita found comfort in the simple thought that no matter what, Lucas would be by her side. And that was enough. The soft morning light filtered through the sheer curtains, casting gentle patterns across the suite. Talita stirred, the warmth of Lucas's arm wrapped around her waist, grounding her as the first hints of wakefulness settled in. For a moment, she let herself linger in the quiet, listening to the distant hum of the city beginning to come, alive outside their window. Lucas shifted beside her, pressing a soft kiss to her shoulder. Morning, he murmured, his voice husky with sleep. Talita smiled, her eyes still closed. Morning. They stayed like that for a while, neither of them rushing to break the peaceful cocoon they had created. But as the sun climbed higher, Talita's thoughts drifted to the message Lucas had received the night before. Do you really think your mom wants to have lunch with us? She asked softly, turning to face him. Lucas brushed his thumb along her cheek, his gaze warm but thoughtful. Yeah, I think she's making an effort, or at least trying to find some common ground. Talita searched his eyes for any trace of doubt, but found none. I guess I just don't want to get my hopes up, she admitted, resting her head against his chest. But I know it's important to you. Lucas's arms tightened around her, his voice soft against her hair. It's important to me that you feel like you're part of this family, but I don't expect everything to change overnight. We'll take it one step at a time. Talita nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle in her heart. As the morning unfolded, they dressed slowly, savoring the quiet moments between them. Talita slipped into a light dress, while Lucas adjusted his tie, catching her eye in the reflection of the mirror. "You look beautiful," he said with a small grin. Talita laughed softly, smoothing her dress. "You're biased." "Completely," Lucas replied without hesitation, stepping behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. By the time they left the hotel, the city had fully come to life, the streets buzzing with energy. Lucas guided Talita through the crowd, his hand resting gently against her back as they made their way to the small restaurant his mother had suggested. Talita's heart fluttered as they approached the entrance, the familiar nerves creeping in despite her best efforts to push them aside. Lucas must have sensed it, because he leaned in, whispering softly into her ear, "Whatever happens, we'll handle it together." Talita smiled, grateful for his reassurance. Inside, Lucas's parents were already seated at a corner table, their expressions softening when they spotted the two of them. His father stood first, shaking Lucas's hand firmly, while his mother offered a small but genuine smile. "Thank you for coming," his mother said, her eyes meeting Talita's, with a quiet warmth she hadn't expected. Talita nodded, returning the smile. "Thank you for inviting us." The conversation began cautiously, small talk filling the spaces where silence might have lingered. Lucas led the way, keeping the energy light as he shared stories from the wedding and their plans for the honeymoon. As the meal progressed, Talita felt the tension in her chest ease. Lucas's mother, though reserved, asked questions about Talita's work, her family, and the wedding details she had admired. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. By the time dessert arrived, Talita found herself laughing at one of Lucas's father's old stories, the warmth in the room feeling less like an obligation and more like the fragile beginnings of connection. As they stood to leave, Lucas's mother gently placed her hand on Talita's arm, stopping her for a moment. "I know I can be protective of Lucas," she said carefully, her gaze steady. "But I can see how much he loves you, and I want you to know I respect that." Talita's heart softened, and she squeezed his mother's hand lightly. "Thank you. That means more than you know." Lucas watched the exchange from a few feet away, a proud smile tugging at his lips. As they stepped out onto the street, Talita let out a soft breath, the weight she had carried for so long finally beginning to lift. Lucas laced his fingers through hers, pulling her close as they walked. "You okay?" he asked, glancing sideways at her. Talita smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Yeah, I think we're going to be just fine." The city stretched out before them, the sun casting a golden glow over the rooftops. And as they walked hand in hand, Talita realized that while the path ahead might not always be smooth, they were ready to face it, together. Hello guys. If you like our stories and haven't subscribed yet, support our work and subscribe to the channel to help us.